Welcome to the Femsplainers. I'm Danielle Crittenden, and I'm still recovering from last episode's interview with author Nancy Jo Sales. I received tons of feedback from you in emails and tweets and comments on social media, 99.9% of which were positive. So thank you so much for that. I will share some of your responses when we do the June listener reaction at the end of the month, just before we go on summer break. But in the meantime, my retired co-splainer Christina Hoff Sommers was so outraged by the interview and on my behalf that she wanted to come on the podcast basically to rant and gossip about it. I was like, yeah, Christina, could have used the reinforcements, but okay. So she'll be on in a second. But just before she comes on for a drink, I want to tell you about our guest who will follow for the main interview, author and journalist Gayle Tzemach Lemmon. Gayle has written an extraordinary book about the fierce female Kurdish warriors who helped defeat ISIS. The book's called Daughters of Kobani, a story of rebellion, courage, and justice. Now, Kabbani is a town in northern Syria near the Turkish border, and many of the women who would take up arms against ISIS came from this town, which was in fact nearly conquered by the terrorist group. These so-called daughters came from traditional families where arranged marriage was expected of them and education was considered wasted on a girl. As they saw ISIS troops successfully conquering other northern cities of Syria, including what became the ISIS capital based in Raqqa, these women decided they did not want to face a worse fate of being enslaved, raped, and even beheaded, as befell the Yazidi women of Iraq. So the Kurdish women defied their families and took up arms. And what followed was maybe one of the most remarkable stories of female heroics in combat, maybe even in the history of combat. Gayle herself has roots in the region. She will tell us her father was forced to flee Baghdad as a child. She grew up in Maryland, but throughout her career, she kept being drawn back to report on these war-devastated countries. Her last book, Ashley's War, the untold story of a team of women soldiers on the Special Ops battlefield set in Afghanistan, is currently being developed into a major motion picture at Universal with Reese Witherspoon producing. Gayle also serves as an adjunct senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, and she spent a decade covering politics at the ABC News political unit. As you can tell, she herself is a super impressive and exceptionally brave woman. So stay with me for that interview after Christina. And just a reminder, if you are enjoying the program, if you're enjoying these conversations that we're having, even the ones that go off the rails like last time, please consider becoming a supporter at Patreon. That's patreon.com/femsplainers. The podcast survives on our subscribers. And hey, we're friends with benefits. We're not just a cheap hookup. We give you something in return. And that is, first of all, a monthly unique episode for our subscribers called Last Call, where you get to ask our guest questions. And you also get our monthly newsletter. And we have a monthly virtual cocktail get-together. So, join a community, join our community, and keep this podcast going. So appreciate it. Patreon.com/femsplainers. And now look, here's Christina with, oh no, Izzy. She brought Izzy. Hi, Christina. Welcome back.
So nice to be here.
Well, I've poured you a beautiful glass of pink champagne, even though I'm not drinking.
Oh, it's lonely without you, but I love the champagne.
So you've been in retirement, and I got a little worried about you.
I don't like that word.
I know.
It's jubilation or whatever the Hispanic word is.
Is there
There's a better word. Jubilation.
Well, you've been in jubilation. And I started to get worried about you again because when I called you the other day, you said you were so excited. This is what you said, exact words. You said, I've just gotten the greatest gift of my life. And I said, really?
This person gets me. Let me just say that.
Okay. Well, and then I said, wow. And I'm just trying to imagine what it is and how many carats or whatever. I said, what is it? And you said, a power washer.
A cordless hydro shot Works WG629E power washer.
They're not even sponsors, Christina. Maybe we could get them. But then, and I was laughing and I was teasing you. And then I thought, I want a power washer too.
I was embarrassed to tell you, but I thought, she's going to think I've gone over the ledge. But instead, you want a power washer.
I know. And then I started boasting about my leaf blower. And then we realized how old we were. Well,
I think we have better values. There's nothing more. There's an inner equanimity that comes from not just having a clean screen porch and deck, but having done it yourself. And I haven't used it yet.
Okay. So you just reach out to this cordless power washer and say, hey, the Femsplainers, and then like a free model.
Yeah, they can market it. To ladies of a certain age.
Well, speaking of ladies of a certain age, so after I hung up from last week's interview with Nancy Jo Sales.
Oh my God, as one person said, the biggest podcast train wreck maybe in history.
It was worse. Remember, we had those ladies who were trying to race shame us.
And the race dinner ladies. They have $3,000 or $6,000. They have dinner with you and race shame you.
Well, yeah, come and actually sort of insult you. And so we had them on. And that was the only time I remember somebody actually hanging up on us. But I think this was in some ways worse.
Because it came out of nowhere.
Yeah,
it was. I've listened to the podcast twice. First of all, I wish I was there to have been on your side, but she probably wouldn't have come on if I'd been on there. But anyway, it came out of nowhere. And the first half of it is going along swimmingly.
This is about, if none of you have listened to this, those of you who have not listened to this, this was author and Vanity Fair writer Nancy Jo Sales talking about her new book, Nothing Personal, my secret life in the dating app Inferno. And we were talking about, how dehumanizing and debilitating and these apps can be and the changes they've brought about to romance and courtship. And it was going along fine. But then I turned to the memoir aspect of her book, in which she, and we're contemporaries. She's like 1 year younger than I am.
She's
and
a woman
58.
In her 50s.
Yeah. And in her 50s, she set her dating profile on Tinder to seeking casual sex with men in their 20s. And it just kept going bad. And it's not to say, look, she had a lot of sex, and the memoir is very raunchy.
Actually, she said some of it was hot. She had some great
and some of it was hot. But put it this way, Fear of Flying, Erica Jong, the Zipless, is far back in the past. And as you read this was not what this was about, because the problem with it, and this went throughout the book, is she kept wondering why these relationships weren't going anywhere. So fine, you want to do this? Fine.
But don't expect.
But then she blamed. But then when they failed, it wasn't like she said, gee, maybe I shouldn't be expecting a long-term relationship with my Uber driver I just had up to my apartment.
Yeah, and advertising yourself as wanting casual sex, that is not exactly an invitation to intimacy.
But then when it didn't work out, she didn't blame herself or think, maybe I should reset my parameters. She blamed the patriarchy. She blamed sexism. She blamed misogyny. She blamed everybody, all the men whom, but not herself. And that was what was.
And you. So in the end, she was blaming you for slut shaming an older woman. And you didn't slut shame her. You asked reasonable questions and got an irrational response from an angry person who bullied you. I wanted to be there she kept saying, don't interrupt me. She would filibuster on and on, carrying on incoherently and hysterically, frankly. And then you would ask for a point of clarification. Don't interrupt me, she would say. As someone said on Twitter, again, you had the patience of a saint.
Well, maybe it's because I've had children, small children, but I think it's also when somebody starts going off like that, there's no point. You realize, and I'm also, remember, I'm watching her on Zoom when we posted some of the video. There's no arguing with someone like that. So I just did my best to sort of deflect the false accusation she gave to me. But I remember, do you remember Brian Lamb, C-SPAN? One of the greatest interviewers of all time.
Fantastic.
He was just like the driest man. He was
no affect.
He was like Dragnet. He was like,
just the facts, man.
Just the facts, ma'am. And he asked very straightforward questions. I think one of his best questions best interviews was with Bill Clinton. And Bill Clinton had just had his book published, and it had come after Hillary Clinton had published It Takes a Village, which was a huge bestseller. And then Brian Lamb, in his just very dry way, said, just going through his list of questions as he did, he said, Mr. President, why do you think your wife's book did so much better than your book? And Bill Clinton, this was a moment to be gallant, to be, to say, well, her book is obviously so much more wonderful.
It's Hillary. What
do you expect? Instead, he went on this long explanation of, well, he didn't, because he was president, he couldn't go to shopping malls to publicize it. And do the kind of events that really sell
bad
books.
Answer.
Also, you just have the biggest podium in the United States. But then somebody later, when Brian Lamb was being interviewed at the press club, at the Washington Press Club, somebody passed him a question that said, when somebody says something like outrageous, why don't you follow up? You never follow up. They say something and you're just like, it's sort of like the Bill Clinton thing. Like, why wouldn't you say, well, Mr. President, you do have a lot of, free publicity. And Brian Lamb said, did you notice that person didn't answer the question or lied or answered it in a peculiar way? And yes.
My job was
what
done.
What are you worried? Your neighbor didn't get it? Or,
Yeah.
And I think with somebody like Nancy Jo, when an interview starts going like that, you try and hold the wheel and sort of try steer into the skid. And if you can't steer into the skid.
And you gave her every opportunity to get back on an even keel, she was never going back.
Right.
And it was all aggression and venom and frankly, hysteria. I was horrified by her response. And I actually found it clinically interesting. And I listened to some other interviews she had done to see how other interviewees coped. And the way to interview Nancy is not to cross her in any way, not to give any hint of a scintilla of even the possibility of disapproval. Because if you do that, she comes at you. She's a very aggressive person, but also, like a lot of aggressive bullies, she's comically insecure.
Yeah.
And at one point, I thought was unbelievable, she used her credentials and said, well, I don't know if your listeners realize that I've got degrees from Columbia and Yale, and I'm a published documentarian and an award-winning. I mean, it was ridiculous.
Well, I didn't want to humble brag, but I didn't go to college.
You always brag about that.
I know, I really do. I didn't go to college. I went to the School of Hard Knocks.
Yeah.
The world was my campus. But no, it was crazy. But it does get to this larger problem of, between the sexes, just people not taking responsibility for their behavior.
Yeah, and she says,
but this is like a classic. This is the feminism we have fought against for so long.
As feminists, we have fought it as feminists.
As the
it's not taking responsibility.
Yeah.
It's not being equal to men. And the other thing that bothered me about her book and about her self-presentation, she's so rigid. And she's narrative driven. It's all about the capitalist, patriarchal, oppressive society. She has no sympathy for men.
No, there was no empathy for anybody she dealt with, slept with. And no, what was funny was, and I think I said this up the top of the podcast, when I was reading her book, so you have these dizzying revolving door of sex, which I'm apparently
multiple incidents. You said,
but I'm apparently, prudish / jealous of this lifestyle.
Pearl clutching. Interestingly enough, she's attacked from the left for being a pearl clutching prude, because I think it was 2015, she came out with a hard hitting piece about dating apps.
Right.
And I can understand the criticism because she overstates her case.
Right.
She overdoes everything. She, she turns everything into a catastrophe, a moral panic.
Well, what was sad? So she had all these incidents, and then she, and she treated these men, like, if you want to say, objectified them, used them for sex, didn't see them as full human beings. When she needed money, tried to find a rich guy to pay her bills. Nothing. That was all empowering. That was all fine. But when the minute one of these guys didn't call her back, or, didn't, step up to help her with her rent, suddenly, it was the patriarchy and sexism. The sad aspect of this is, because she couldn't see her own behavior or appreciate or have any nuanced perception of the male behavior, it really affected her reporting. And her reporting, in the first part of the interview, it is true that dating apps have profoundly affected, courtship, everything.
Which was interesting. A lot of what she said was
and she's done good reporting on, interviewing and talking to all these young girls and blah, blah, blah. But the problem is, if you're going to be a reporter, you can't go into a subject and
with a fixed point of view.
Well, have the narrative confirm your point of view. Basically, so if these apps really are devastating to young women, as she says, then that's important to know. Except now I can't assess it. They may or may not be, because she went in with that in mind. She went in to prove the misogyny of the dating apps, to prove the sexism.
It's advocacy nonfiction,
right?
And proposing as a serious investigation. And she's intelligent, and she has a lot of knowledge, and she could have told an interesting story, but she has this idée fixe. She will stick to the narrative no matter what. She went on a podcast called Guys We Fucked.
What?
Yeah.
Sorry, censor alert.
Yeah, with Corinne Fisher and Kiri somebody. And she's telling, and they got along very well.
Oh, that's a real empowering name for a podcast, right? That's not dehumanizing to men. Well, imagine if there was a male.
She was right at home.
I guess
she
it was called
in her
Howard
element.
Stern.
And they're supposed to be. And one of the things that I find interesting is she's constantly talking about how women are so abused online. But the best data we have suggests that it's a complicated mix. It's mostly men who get threats and insults, and women are more sexually harassed, but men get more, like threats of killing them and so forth. Right. But on this Guys We Fucked podcast, she tells the story of being called an old lady by Slate. And she said, and it was a woman. And by the way, when women are abused online, it's almost always other women. Other women.
Well, that was true in my case.
Are vicious, yes. But one of these babes calls the Slate writer a cunt. And it's just so hypocritical. The whole thing, posing. She's connected to a lot of young women, and they write to her, and she advises them, and she has this position at Vanity Fair, and to me it just typified how dysfunctional the contemporary prestige media is at this time. Just these quirky personalities, these unreliable narrators, and crazy people.
Well, I think when you have a young man into your apartment whom you've never met. You haven't met him publicly. You haven't sussed him out first, even. You have him into your apartment, and you suddenly realize that as he's coming up the stairs, this is the fact. And this is a woman who said she was once sexually assaulted. She puts a pair of scissors in her back pocket because she realizes what she has done. She is inviting this complete stranger into her apartment and for sex, and then suddenly realizes maybe this isn't the greatest idea, to the degree that she put scissors in her back pocket.
They did end up having scissors in my back pocket when
I come over.
When you come over, because I just never know. I never know. And if you have your dogs.
I mean, that's what you do when you hear a thump in the night, and you go down the stairs with, some.
Well, here's the interesting thing.
Some hat pin.
Here's the ultimate thing about her, having listened to the other podcasts and seen different sides of her. First of all, she has a romantic side.
Well, no, but that's the point. She
wanted
romance
and romance,
but
she starts lamenting that young women today don't they don't get thunderstruck. They don't have that one enchanted evening where they see someone across the room. Yeah, we've been saying that, but she correctly perceives that heterosexual romance,
right, is
and
tricky.
The loveliness. It's so tricky. You're not really allowed to celebrate it, but yet she craves it, and I sympathize with that. And she had some. I didn't read the book, but I've listened to the podcast. She had a skateboarder. I don't know, some guy she fell in love with.
This was the guy she met with the scissors.
Oh, so what was the one that fixed her bookcase?
That was Abel. He was from the West. He was from the Midwest, and he was the one who ended up. Yeah, she got really fixated by him. And then he ended up, and he sort of is the thread through the book of, and, they're off and on for several years, and he would vanish, and then she would wait for him to text her. And then she finally found out that he had been lying to her completely about who he was.
Stealing money.
He had been stealing money, but you know what? She still kept seeing him because now she could live in truth with him, knowing that he had lied and stolen money from her.
All right, that's
so I'm sorry. And I think what was refreshing, I had, of course, my daughter Miranda up top of it as a millennial.
Right, Miranda was the voice of sanity.
Well, but I think she also pointed to the fact that, yes, romance is difficult. Courtship is changing. These apps have had a profound effect. But and what Miranda said, which I thought was wistful and true, and this goes to maybe more what Nancy Jo should be thinking about is, I just want to meet someone in a bar, i.e. in real life. I want somebody to come up to me and start chatting and have something spontaneous. And I think that's the issue.
As Miranda said so charmingly, just to have a beautiful story.
Yes.
We want that story of, meeting in your eye, and then he has a cute way of coming and talking to you, and so
right. And I don't think that's gone. But we have to learn, or find some way to bring that into this world. But it's not going to happen if you think everybody on the other end of your phone is a
sociopathic
serial killer,
Mr. Goodbar,
or sexist, misogynistic pig.
Stop that with that all men are they're like she says at one point, I'm like everybody. I want connection. I want love. You know what? Boys and men, they want that too. Yeah. And there are a few sociopaths out there and sociopathic women. And I honestly don't think that Nancy Sales is sociopathic. She's a little narcissistic, a little neurotic, but deep down, she's kind of old fashioned and does want love and romance and a man to protect her. And this society, I don't know, she's a little older than you would expect to still have the burden of these contemporary teachings, but she's a little immature. So she seems to have these silly ideas. And instead of speaking about about the complexity of the situation, she simplifies and narrows, and it's almost totalitarian in the end with her thinking. And she ends up being a bully to you.
Yeah, I can take it. You know that.
Well, she didn't know. You were, if for nothing else, watch this and watch the video of Danielle, and I can kind of see that look in her eye. It's a look in her eye when someone wants, I don't know if they mugged you or they mugged somebody, and she said, I'm not going to take that. And then she chases them and nabs them.
Well, speaking of that, I'm being bullied by Izzy.
Yeah,
right
Izzy's limit. But I have a question to ask you.
Yeah.
Do you have any desire, or I won't say possibility because I know there are good possibilities, but desire to sleep with 20-year-olds?
Oh, God.
Because I so don't.
My late mother-in-law was a famous interviewer for Canadian television. And she was a strong feminist and real female icon. And an interviewer, she was married for, happily married for over 35 years. And an interviewer asked her, do you ever dream of being single again? And she said, I have nightmares about it. Right? And I think the thought, let's just get past the ooh factor of, that somebody like that being the age of my son.
Yeah.
Why? As Miranda said, look, if you're going to go be a cougar, go for a 33-year-old,
at least
like they still will go out
or
and drink with you.
40-year-old.
Well, they'll still go out and drink with you, but
I'll take a good-looking 60-year-old. I don't want.
You're really being a cougar.
A 60-year-old? Yeah, maybe I know my age. Oh God.
Next, you're going to say, I want a hot 55-year-old.
That'd be okay. But at 20, I would process. I've said this before on the pod. I would see him as my son, and then I would want to, advise him on his career or something.
And then say, can you stop dressing like a skateboarder?
Yeah. And why are you wasting time with women, the age of your grandmother? I would be parental. I don't get it. And I know with men, even with men, I've asked a few men, do you aspire to be with 20-year-olds? Most of them don't.
No, it's a bit creepy, but anyway, well.
And you want somebody with, and if you have how do I put this delicately? If you have an aging body or an imperfect body, it is not the body of a 20-year-old, it's kind of nice to have somebody that has a lived-in body as well.
or blackout blinds.
I'm grateful. I have a gentleman friend who has poor eyesight, and I am.
Yeah, you wanted to be that haze, one of those
so
filters.
Grateful, and I have special light.
and then they're always grateful on the male side to be a little bit deaf, so they don't have to hear all your nagging.
They're so grateful.
All right. Well, thank you for stopping by the top of the podcast, Christina. Always great to have you over for a drink.
Here, I miss you, and I'm sorry I wasn't there to defend you from.
That's all right. You were power washing.
I think we have to have her back on, the two of us, an honest conversation.
I don't think she's coming back.
I think she might. She's crazy enough.
I don't think so.
To be continued.
It's too triggering. Now you're triggering me. Now let's go to Gayle Tzemach Lemmon. She is author of the book, The Daughters of Kobani, a story of rebellion, courage, and justice, right after this message from our first sponsor. In my years as a journalist and podcast host, I've learned that interviewing isn't that easy. Not if you want to get interesting and sometimes surprising facts out of people. Just asking straightforward questions won't always reveal important information or observations that even your subject hadn't thought about before. That's why I love Storyworth. Storyworth is an online service that helps people you are interested in your own life, whether it's a relative or a friend, share stories through thought-provoking questions about their memories and personal thoughts. It's a fun new way to engage with them, especially if you can't be together in person. And best of all, Storyworth comes up with the questions for you. I wish I had that sometimes. So, especially as Father's Day approaches, Storyworth is a heartfelt and sentimental gift that will make the dads in your life feel loved and appreciated on Father's Day. And it's one the whole family will cherish together forever. Here's how it works. Every week, Storyworth emails your dad a different story prompt. Questions you may never thought to ask, like, what is your favorite story about your own father? And what things are you proudest of in life? Storyworth has helped numerous families learn about each other in profound, special ways, and their testimonials will practically move you to tears. In fact, Storyworth has already created a powerful experience for me because I used it to interview my own mother for Mother's Day last year. And there's no shortage of surprises when reading the weekly stories. fun facts you never knew. Like the reason my mother hates certain vegetables is because her own mother hated cooking and ruined pretty much everything she served. And they make your family feel close even when you're not together. After 1 year, Storyworth will compile all your dad's stories, including photos, into a beautiful keepsake book that's shipped for free. My own dad died many years ago, and I tell you, I wish I'd had Storyworth back then to record his life, because you think you're going to remember things at the time, but honestly, you never do. So give your dad the most meaningful gift this Father's Day with Storyworth. Get started right away with no shipping required by going to storyworth.com/femsplain. That's storyworth.com/femsplain. You'll get $10 off your first purchase. Storyworth.com/femsplain for $10 off. Welcome to the Femsplainers.
Thank you for having me. I'm delighted to join you.
Well, I am so excited to have you. I mean, as your book is just such a masterwork of storytelling, but that also weaves in very complicated politics and even history of this region. And I have to admit that, you know, those of us who follow these things from afar, I almost have been, I'm interested in the Middle East. I follow the sort of cursory news, but like you sort of feel the minute you start dipping your toe into the Kurds, the Syrians, you're going to be sucked in and never come out, because it's so complicated. And yet you managed not just to tell the story of these absolutely extraordinary women, but you got into the narrative just beautifully, made me understand what was going on, the regional conflicts, the politics, without overwhelming me. So bravo for that, because I know how difficult that is to do. And you also kept yourself in the background, but you're over there reporting, and that has to be an amazing story in itself. So I hope we can get to that as well. But first, on the book itself, it says it's the most far-reaching experiment in women's equality in the least likely place in the world, brought to you by women who've been battling ISIS town by town, street by street since 2013. And that's maybe the most extraordinary thing, is that here in the Middle East, where women's rights are awful, you have, as you say, the most incredible experiment going on. So let's talk about these women. Tell me how you came upon them.
The story started when one of the soldiers from Ashley's War, my second book, about an all-women special operations team, called me from Syria and said, you have to come. You have to see what's happening here. There are women leading the fight against ISIS. And it's not just that it's women leading the fight, it's that they're leading men and women in battle. And they're not just fighting against ISIS, they're fighting for women's equality.
So exactly. So let's start. You had sort of, I guess, the four main women, I don't want to call them characters, but the narratives that you followed. And correct me if I'm mispronouncing: Rajda, Azima, Nowruz, and Rojda.
And Nareen, exactly, yeah.
And let's talk about some of these women and their family backgrounds, and what they, before all of this happened and before they got involved in fighting.
I'm so glad you asked this, because I think so many times when we talk about women who do remarkable and groundbreaking things, we call them exceptions. And when we talk about men who do remarkable and groundbreaking things, we call them leaders. Mm-hmm. And it was really important to me to show that these were not superhuman or superheroes. These were women who were in extraordinary circumstances and quite ordinary people. Rojda thought she'd be a pharmacist. Nowruz thought maybe she'd be a lawyer. And the truth is that none of us knows what comes next before us, right, in life. And they were women who took up arms really to protect their neighborhoods at the start of the Syrian civil war. And what came next morphed into a conflict that eventually involved the Islamic State and thrust them onto the global stage. But these were all people who had, quite normal and ordinary lives in the run-up to an extraordinary David versus Goliath story in which David is also a woman.
Well, let's talk about some of the, I mean, they still came, they're Kurdish, obviously, and they still came from these very traditional backgrounds. And I loved how you got into their stories. So Azima, who really stands out and became one of the great leaders, tell us about where she grew up. And
Sure. So these are all young women who grew up in families across northeastern Syria. So Azima is a high school volleyball star, a devoted athlete, and kind of the friend in your group who always is the person who won't take no for an answer. That's her. You know, the one who, if somebody's giving you a hard time, you turn to and you know she'll take care of it. That's who she was from the time she was young. And when Kobani, this little town, is facing ISIS, she's one of the only people who says it's not going to fall to ISIS. We are going to beat ISIS, which at that time was the equivalent of saying we're going to land a person on the moon, right? It just was completely far-fetched for the Syrian Kurds to think that that was going to happen, but she always believed it. And then there's Rojda, deeply introverted, loves soccer, loves Diego Maradona, and, you know, would much prefer reading a book than being on CNN or any of the things she later had to do, and takes this journey from a girl who gets in trouble for playing soccer in her grandmother's village, all the way to being America's interlocutor in the fight to retake the capital, so-called capital, Raqqa, from the Islamic State. Then there's Nareen, who's a young woman who was told she couldn't marry the person she loved because that's not what her family did. She couldn't go to university studies because that's not what girls in her family did. And we go all the way from her living in a universe of no to creating her own yes, and ending up helping to liberate her hometown from the Islamic State, and having girls come up to her and say, you know, I want to be like you. And I think it's that journey that so many women, wherever you are in the world, understand, from people putting rules in place that govern your lives that you had no say in writing, to reshaping those rules and determining what your own world is going to look like.
Well, it was, I mean, what was interesting to me is in other memoirs and stories about women in the Middle East, you know, they've come from similarly quite strict backgrounds. And in all of these cases, as you describe, these Kurdish women seem to have more freedom than some in women in other sort of Muslim societies or Middle Eastern societies. Yet they also still, there were expectations that their fathers or grandfathers or uncle, as it may be, would determine who they would marry. I forget which one was forbidden to get an education, that she was told not. And each of them seemed to share this kind of, I mean, they were, and some just one, I think it was Azima, didn't want to get married at all.
Right, exactly. Yeah, she said, I'll never do it. This is terrible.
This is, I mean, just looking around and looking at the role of women.
Yeah.
So each of them had an opinion. Each of them had some ambition. And then when that ambition, or as you point out, when the person they wanted to marry, they were forbidden to do it, they felt thwarted and slightly rebellious. And that's what kind of pushed them to then go on and take this role, correct?
Yes. And here's the thing. They grew up in deeply conservative society, in a society that had a pretty clear view of what women did. And while we think that's so far removed from the United States, it was so interesting talking to my mother-in-law, who said, you know, when I came out of college, there were three things that women did. You were a teacher, you were a nurse, or you were a secretary. Everyone told you, you married to the person who your parents thought was right for you. And so that she's, you know, we knew what was prescribed for us. And I think that's very universal. And the truth is, it is about the universal quest for human dignity. Mm-hmm. And the right to decide what your own life looks like. And I knew that myself personally. I talk about it a little bit in my funny discussions my father and I would have, my father being from the region. But I don't think it's regionally bound. I think it's about young people who say, wait a minute, just because it has been doesn't mean it has to be.
Right. But in another, you know, if they had been born in Saudi Arabia, for example, that they might have had all these aspirations, or been Yazidi women, for example, and had all these aspirations, but never would they have been able to have their families permission to go do this. And that was sort of seemed unique about the Kurds, is that even though they objected to what their daughters did and were going to do, they were still, for lack of a better word, allowed to do it.
Yes, I'll tell you. I think yes with an asterisk, because, the prologue of the book really talks about how war reshapes societies. And without the existential threat of outsiders coming in, I think it would have been much more difficult for these young women to have had the impact that they did, not just on their families, because they did reshape their own families, but really on their neighborhoods and on their societies, because the whole, Gina Davis always talks about, if you can see it, you can be it. There is a lot to that. I interviewed a dad in the town of Kobani years after the town defeated ISIS, right? Handed ISIS its first defeat. And I said to him, what do you think of this huge statue to a young woman warrior that's right in the middle of your town? Something unlike I've ever seen. And there's a picture of it in the book. And he looked at me and he said, well, and he took a little photo out of his daughter. And he said, my daughter's fought 3 times on the front line and she's been injured twice. And I never thought this would be her life, ever. But if it's what brings us freedom, then it's worth it. And I think it is the combination, the mix of ideology plus opportunity plus a truly existential threat that thrusts them onto the international stage in a way that no one could have anticipated.
Let's pause the conversation for just a second so we can have a quick word from one of our other sponsors of this episode. I was at a party recently and a friend of mine showed me, can I call it baby pictures of her new kitten? Of course, the kitten was adorable, but this friend of mine lives in an apartment. It's going to be an indoor cat. And I wondered how my friend was going to cope with the smell and mess of cat litter. Have you tried Pretty Litter? I asked her. Why, no, she said. Ha, I said, well, Pretty Litter is the best litter for your cat. How so? She asked. Well, I said, first, it's the only litter that keeps tabs on your cat's health. In fact, it changes colors to help detect early signs of potential illness, including urinary tract infections and kidney issues. We know how cats like to hide their illnesses, the little stoics. Second, litter box cleanup is easier with Pretty Litter too. Its ultra-absorbent crystals trap odor instantly and they last up to a month. It's not like conventional litter. There's less scooping, less clumping. Plus, Pretty Litter is safer for your cat and for the whole household. Many conventional litters contain irritants that can aggravate allergies and asthma. But Pretty Litter's super light crystal base minimizes mess and dust. And finally, Pretty Litter arrives safely at your door in a small, lightweight bag. Shipping is free, and you never have to worry about storing bulky containers. So my friend said, wow, okay, how do I get this litter? So I told her, go to prettylitter.com and use promo code FEMSPLAIN for 20% off your first order. That's prettylitter.com, promo code FEMSPLAIN for 20% off. prettylitter.com, promo code FEMSPLAIN. And then I offered my friend a drink. Well, so now let's set the scene of Kobani. As you say, this was the first sort of town to gain victory over ISIS. Tell us, and also, just so when you're reading your book, and as you say, the existential crisis that is going on in the region, you start to think, do I have problems? No, I do not have problems. It's almost biblically bad. It's so horrifying what is happening around them. So tell us a little bit about Kobani itself, what type of town it was, and what happened when ISIS came in or attacked. And then this is, what got these women going, basically.
That's right. So 2014 is the year that ISIS shook the universe, because all of a sudden the world had to pay attention to its barbarity, to its ideology, to its willingness to deploy tactics that others found even too far for them, including Al-Qaeda. And ISIS comes and takes this town of Sinjar and commits true crimes against humanity, right? Separates men from women in this town, and kills men and then takes women to be bought and sold, quite literally, in real time.
And
with the whole world watching. Yes. Just a level of inhumanity that I think even those of us who've had the privilege of seeing a lot find absolutely impossible to get our imaginations around. And not long afterward, just a couple months afterward, you have this convergence of factors. The Americans are seeking a partner on the ground to stop ISIS that will bring the fight to ISIS and keep the fight with ISIS. The Syrian Kurds understand what just happened in Sinjar with ISIS and are saying, we will fight to the last person. This is where we are going to make a stand. We are not letting ISIS take our town unless we die with it. And then you have a world and a social media community that's all of a sudden paying huge attention to this David versus Goliath story. ISIS comes into this town of Kobani, few had ever heard of, with a fighting force few had ever heard of, and just tries to steamroll it as it has just done with the biggest, much bigger towns of Mosul and Iraq, Raqqa and Syria. And all of a sudden you have this kind of very unusual militia with women right at the heart and women's equality right at the core, saying, no, we're going to bring the fight to ISIS until the very end. And really giving these guys who've never lost one battle at that point, a truly difficult battle. And that's when the Americans step in and say, hey, wait a minute, maybe this is somebody we can work with and we shouldn't. And lots of folks you'll meet in the book from the military side, from the diplomatic side, are saying, wait a minute, we can't let these people be killed because they might be our best hope in stopping the Islamic State.
So talk about the creation. It's called the YPJ, correct? The women's unit of the broader, I guess, Kurdish Democratic Forces.
Yes. So the People's Protection Units are formed in around 2011. That's men and women who take up arms to protect their neighborhoods, to keep other people out, more or less, and to maybe tangle with the regime, but hopefully thinking that taking up arms enough will be a deterrent to keeping outsiders from entering their neighborhoods in the chaos of what becomes the Syrian civil war. 2013, by then, fast forward 2 years, they've already had clashes with al-Qaeda-linked groups. They've already had clashes with the predecessor to the Islamic State. And women and men are fighting together. And the women say, we need women's protection units. We need an all-women's force. And this had a tradition in some of the other work that Kurds elsewhere had done. But I asked Rojda in 2017, why in 2013 did you need to form women's protection units? You already had ideology that said you were equal and you were already fighting alongside men. And she said, well, you can't let stand a world in which women are bought and sold in our property, in which women are treated like nothing. And secondly, we just didn't want men taking credit for our work. And I thought, oh my gosh, right in the middle of the interview, I just started laughing because, northeastern Syria feels very removed. It is purposely from its neighbors by its neighbors disconnected to much of the rest of the world. And yet here was the most universal sentiment that no one who has been born female has ever lived without understanding.
Right. You said in the book, you say, by creating all female units, they made clear that, but also women would be responsible for their own decisions and their own defense. Women could and would lead men in battle, but women would not be led by men. So what was that just about credit, or was there other concerns that if, I don't want to go back to my father and uncle's house?
It was a lot about credit, quite honestly. It was also about precedent and ideology. So they follow as an ideological and spiritual leader, this leader named Abdullah Öcalan, who's sitting in jail in Turkey. And his whole philosophy was that the Kurds could not be free until women were free. And that the history of Kurdish men, Kurdish society was this enslavement that had to do with women's subjugation and what he called the housewifeization of women's work. So the whole notion that he had advanced was that equality was right at the core. And so for women who were following what they had seen elsewhere, and they thought, why would we be under command structure that didn't really have equality and women's leadership right at the heart of who we are?
Right. I love, especially in the beginnings, as these units or really opposition was forming, that they had these study groups, and that's where these ideas and that they had originated, as you point out, from this like old Jewish commie in New York who had written all these tracts and then had been picked up by I'm sorry,
Öcalan, yeah.
Öcalan, and then carried into the Middle East, and then is in the hands of these women studying it. So let's just talk about some of them. I mean, you open the book where you're sort of in a staging area close to the front. This was by Kobani, correct?
This was by Raqqa in the summer of 2017.
So at that point you were at Raqqa.
Yeah.
And that's right. And you saw, I think it's one of the women so by this point, they are now seasoned fighters.
Yes.
Just commanding not just these women, but these men. And what was your thought when you saw this? And the men, of course, all following it, but also respect amongst all of them.
Yes, deep mutual respect, right? I think that went both directions. And I did feel like I was in science fiction. I mean, in what world are women leading men and women in battle with no one publicly, at least, questioning it? And in what world does a public affairs person say, I say no to you, you can't go to the front lines, but if Clara, the commander, takes you, then I have to listen because she's my boss. Mm-hmm. And I remember looking at my team thinking, does anybody else think that this is deeply unusual to see 25 young women with smiley face socks and fatigues and Timex watches and braids and AK-47s going off to fight the men who bought and sold women?
Right. No, and talk about, so there were just, I mean, some of the scenes, I literally, my nails, I was chewing down because reading about the battles that they were in, starting with the battle for Kabbani, just describe some of the things that they were facing and the odds that they were facing, and then the situations.
Yeah. So I'll take it in that order. So what they were facing ISIS fighters who were really seasoned with heavy weaponry. They were low on people in Kobani, low on fuel, low on food, low on weapons, low on ammunition. The one thing they had was will. And so Nowruz gets on the radio when things look very bleak. And Kobani, was not the town anybody, including American officials, had put money on to hand ISIS its first defeat. But Nowruz gets on the radio to her field commanders, she's the head of the women's protection units, and says, these men think you're worth nothing. They think you have absolutely no value. So show them what you're made of, so that even if this is your last moment, it will stand for something. And that speech gets recreated in battles that kind of go forward from there. But Kobani is one where, ISIS fighters would get on the radio and say, we're coming to behead you, coming to enslave you, things that I wouldn't print, things that I wouldn't even repeat, far, far worse than that. And, Nowruz and Rojda, they would never get back on the radio, but some of the younger people they led would, and they, oh yeah, you're such a man, then come out and show yourself. And, sometimes they would, just from sheer, need to respond.
I some of the deepest pleasure from reading this book is knowing just how insulted the ISIS fighters would be to be being beaten by women. Yeah. And gruesomely, as you described, that when they caught or shot a woman, what they did to body.
It was, you say this, and we talk about war as if it's not personal. We talk about policy as if it's not made up of people. And neither one of those is true. And I interviewed Azima and Rojda once, and I said, did you see your friends get beheaded by ISIS fighters? And you have people who are truly human, like you and me talking, talking about normal things. We were talking about, I think at that point, we'd been talking about travel times to some town. And I went back to interviewing, and they said, yeah. And Rojda kind of shrugged and said, all the time. And I try to imagine, as somebody who is focused on humanity, what was that like? And how do you not take that with you? And that's why the opening quote in the book is Marcus Aurelius: the best revenge is not to be like your enemy. Because it was something they talked about and thought about frequently.
And we are talking about warfare of a kind that is, especially in Kobani, they had very little American reinforcement. They weren't getting that till later. So they're low on weapons. They're fighting these superior forces. They're outnumbered. They're going from house to house through narrow streets, passing through snipers. And then, coming, and then, as you say, the ISIS were masters at wiring and detonating. I mean, even tea kettles, everything was booby trapped.
Everything.
And yet, what was incredible, I wanted to talk about this a little bit, that they behaved, as far as one can tell, exactly like, a brave male soldier would behave. That one of the things we've talked about in the United States is the problems of women in combat, especially I remember in the 90s when that was coming in. And I remember feeling very reluctant about women going into combat, mainly because at the time, maybe it's the American military, there were all these physical demands. You had to be able to carry like a 90-pound pack for 15 miles. You had to be able to throw a grenade a certain distance without blowing yourself up. And what was, and then you also had the tensions between men and women. And would you be messing with the unit's head if you threw a female? I can see you shaking your head in disgust. Throwing a female.
No, I've heard all these ways of Ashley's war. I'm more nodding in acknowledgement of all these debates.
So you think this isn't crazy, and yet from the descriptions of battle in your book, including one of the women leading a D-Day operation across the Euphrates at night by Zodiac boat with ISIS above them on the other side. And it was mind-blowing. And they didn't seem to have, the women were as fit as men. Maybe it's the type of warfare that they're in, that you're not sort of have this World War II image of, running with huge packs. But talk about a little difference, maybe the things that they did well, but also maybe were there these kinds of challenges that they just had to overcome?
So nowhere in the world have I seen women more comfortable with power and less apologetic about being in charge. And it comes from many things, but part of it was from having tested themselves deeply and thoroughly in battle. And when I would talk to US folks who were their counterparts on the special operations side, they would say it wasn't about they were this kind of warrior or that kind of warrior. It was about the fact that they prepared and prepared and prepared and prepared. And they were always ready to execute and get the job done. And you cannot replicate that will, and you cannot replicate courage of that kind, to be able to willing to take an objective and to do whatever is required to keep it and then advance. And that's what you heard over and over. It was not an accident that US folks who were authorizing the airstrikes in the battle for Kobani would end up sleeping in their conference rooms on Tempur-Pedic mattresses because they wanted to be ready in case they were needed at any time, after they were watching these women and men fight room by room and house by house. And here's Rojda in Kobani, puts her AK-47 through a wall and brushes up against the leg of an ISIS fighter. That's how close they were to the people who had come to kill them. And so I think that, to me, trying to capture for the reader their courage and their commitment and their valor, because the first thing that they said, one of the members of the Women's Protection Unit said to me in the summer of 2017 was, we're writing our own history now. This is not about us only. This is about all the generations of girls to come later.
And as you say, that incredible real motivation, you quoted one of the women commanders trying to rally her troops, as you point out, whether you're male or female, you're in this terrifying situation, and you have to keep up as the leader. You have to keep up their morale. And she said to her sister warriors, she said, "Remember, this fight is not just for you. It would be better to die with dignity here today than to become their slave." So when you, as you say, are brushing up against that lead and you think it's not just about getting shot, this is beyond what we are fighting for. Is we're fighting against the enslavement as well. So
that's right. Very much so. And you talk about the crossing in the town of Manbij. So women led that. And actually, it was a U.S. Service member who said, it was women who crossed at night in a really dangerous crossing to Manbij.
Most of them couldn't swim.
That's correct. And they wouldn't take the Americans' flotation devices because sometimes they weighed more than they did. Right. And in some cases, they said, oh, you know what? Americans like, no, I'm not taking your fancy gear. I'm either going to make it or I'm not going to make it, but I'm not going to die drowning with this thing. I know what I'm here for, and that's all I care about. And the Americans were truly taken aback by just the absolute commitment. And that's why there's a moment where there's a member of the U.S. Special Operations community is watching all these young women, some with flowers in their hair, in the flatbed of a truck going off to fight ISIS, kind of hugging each other and high-fiving as they're at the rally point. And he thinks of the MacArthur speech at West Point in 1962, duty, honor, country.
Right. I loved those special ops guys that you had. And they were good. Like they were so, they came and go, okay, not used to seeing this, but it seemed very quickly not only won over, but became real advocates for those units and to get the Americans involved, or at least helping in, which again, the very complicated regional politics and the role America plays. The other women I wanted to talk about too were the ones who became the political leaders, who were part writing charters, constitutions. There were two, Fauzi and Ilham. Talk a little bit about them and what they contributed and where they came from.
Sure. So Fauzi Yusuf and Ilham Ahmed, who are both very active in the region's politics today, were both women who came at it from having faced in their own families, their own rebellions, right? Here's Fauzi Yusuf, has the misfortune of being born a girl child. And no one picks her up for a week because they didn't want any more girls. It was a shame to have another girl in the family, which is true for much of the world. And she goes on to really fight to get women mentioned 13, then 14 times in the founding documents that govern northeastern Syria, which are recognized by absolutely no one outside its borders, but are very clear. Yes to women's equality, yes to girls' education, no to child marriage, no to dowry, yes to women's economic opportunity, yes to women's political representation. And all of these things come because there are women who are truly fighting for them throughout. And Fauzi, I said to her once, didn't people tell you this is too much too fast? This would be too much in the United States to do this, all of these things about women and girls in your document. And she says, well, of course people told us it was too much too fast. But if we didn't take our rights now, when were we going to take them?
Right. And then, and these women earn such incredible respect, including from their families. Like I like when the uncles who were, telling them not to play soccer and marry my son and blah, blah, blah. They by the end of the war, they have this strange new respect for these incredible women. And you also had the scene in Raqqa where the town was finally taken from ISIS and there were finally celebrations. And these young girls, these children would come up and see these female fighters and what an incredible example was. And then Turkey came in. I remember this, where everybody just abandoned the Kurds again. And these women who had started off to go to international conferences and really build the world that they had rescued and fought for were betrayed by the Americans and the West. Tell us.
So October 2019, right, Turkish-backed incursion begins. And we follow in the story the same women who've been fighting ISIS for and alongside the United States, Europe, the rest of the world, are now going back to the same towns they liberated from the Islamic State to defend them against NATO ally Turkey, only this time they're alone.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted readers to just kind of live in that moment. My job with these stories is never to tell you how to feel, but it's to take you in with the flashlight and show you the very real lives. War is never made up of nameless, faceless people. This story is about young women who stood up and said, no more, this far and no further. And we are going to be the ones writing history and saying who matters right now.
And where are they now? Are you still in contact with them? And what are these 4 women that we discussed at the beginning? June?
Yes, so I am in contact with them. I think they've been so deeply moved and also, I think, quite surprised in some ways by how few people knew their story, and also, deeply moved by how personally people have taken it. They all continue to work to protect their areas and their political project. This is first and foremost an experiment in self-rule that has, as the book talks about, the right to practice your, celebrate your holidays, publish in your language, teach in your language, name your children what you wish, be able to move where you'd like to without the Syrian regime arresting you. These are all the things that they were fighting for initially, just for the ability to govern themselves, not for statehood, but for self-rule. And that project, even with all the challenges, continues today. And, frequently we say there's much more hope in northeastern Syria than in northwest Washington, because the thing that stays with you is just this deeply can-do spirit. And their fate, I think, in this moment does hang in the balance as the new administration comes in and really decides what its policy priorities are.
Before you go, I just want a little bit more about yourself. So like the good journalist you are, you keep yourself in the background, but there you are up at the front, traveling back and forth from, Washington, D.C. to this hellscape at many times. Why did tell us how you felt doing that, and were you frightened, and what did your family think? If I could.
So it's a huge privilege, right, to be able to go to parts of the world where people are experiencing very difficult things. And the thing that strikes you about northeastern Syria is that unless you're on the front lines, your biggest threat is normalcy and this very real, very fragile sense of life going on that can lull you into not paying attention to what's going on around you. And you always have to be vigilant. I don't care where you are in the world, but especially when there are a multitude of threats, you have to be aware. And the truth is that local forces in northeastern Syria across communities, Arab, Kurd, Christian, have really brought an endangered but truly enveloping sense of normal to much of the areas they govern. And that always surprises people. The last time I was in Kobani, I almost bought pink sparkly tennis shoes for one of my children, right? Because they have this kind of Champs-Élysées, they call it in Kobani, right? Where you can go shopping. Was I scared?
You've been in multiple war zones, right? As you're in your
career.
But
I mean, I'm certainly not immune to fear. I think it's what you do with fear that is always the question for me. But the biggest thing was your worry for the people that are you putting people in danger, right? The tyranny of the passport means that you can leave, but the people who are working with you would have that much greater challenge. So to me, that's the first question always. Am I making sure I'm not endangering anybody? In this case, these women had already fought ISIS. So there was very little that they were personally worried about in speaking with me. But the biggest risk is just wrong place, wrong time. And of course you have a lot of moments in which you're deeply nervous. But I wanted readers to come in with me in that first trip to the front lines, right, in Raqqa in 2017, where I was deeply scared, and write to the readers, it was too quiet. The only sound was mortar rounds and small arms fire. And the Americans weren't the ones who had cleared the area. It was this partner force, right? And so I was deeply nervous about what ISIS was willing to do for certain, but also completely compelled by watching women take the same trip to the front line every single day as if it were a normal commute to work because they had fought ISIS for a half decade.
Right. Do you, you said at the beginning of the book, like you had planned not to go back to that region. And as you pointed out, you're
back to war, right?
Right. And your father is Kurdish, correct?
My father was Iraqi born. So my father was born in Baghdad. His grandmother was from, his mother, my grandmother was from Kirkuk, and his father's from Kirkuk and his mother was from Baghdad. And my father lost his country as a boy for being from the wrong religion at the time. And the sense of place, I think in many ways, I didn't really understand him until I saw for myself truly where he was from. And it really was deeply moving for me. He had long passed by that time, but I think it was very personal. It is the most personal book of the three that I've written. But I will say that the transcending thought for all of the work is about grace. And you see the worst and the absolute best of humanity pressed up right against each other. And who wouldn't want to know about the women who were creating this experiment and what the world would look like if women were equal, right on the ashes of the fight against the Islamic State as America's partner.
Are you going to go back?
God willing, yeah. I hope so.
You said you wouldn't. You said
yeah, I did. I said that at the beginning of the story.
Classic great journalist. Right? You cannot resist the pull of a story, but also one, as you point out, that is so deeply personal to you. So, Gayle, I can't thank you enough for writing this book and this work that you have risked your life to bring these stories to us. So thank you so much. And thank you for coming on the podcast.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's a true privilege to tell stories that take away the other. And I hope people realize that national security is everybody's work.
Yes. Very true. But thank you again.
Thank you.
Wow, those women are amazing. Gayle is amazing. Daughters of Kobani has also, in fact, been optioned for a film, which is fantastic because this story just deserves to be widely known. I wanted to conclude by reading a quote from Gayle's book by one of the female soldiers, Nowruz. Gayle asked her what she wanted a girl in the region born 20 years from now to understand about the war women waged in the fight against ISIS. And Nowruz answered, she told me that she wanted girls from across communities to know their own worth and to be strong enough to forge their own way. Quote, I want her to know how to protect herself, how to be independent, and how to be powerful, she said. I want her to grow up with this mentality, to have her own strength and not allow any obstacles in her way. We might not be alive then, but this must stay as part of history. See you next time. The Femsplainers is a weekly podcast carried on the Ricochet Network and available pretty much on every podcast platform. Follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, and watch video of our interviews on YouTube. You'll find links to everything, plus how to contact us directly at femsplainers.com. We survive and depend on your support. Like the show? Consider donating as little as $1 a month at patreon.com/femsplainers and get our exclusive monthly bonus episode, Last Call, in which you get to join the conversation with our guests. And there's much more. And a big shout out of thanks to our audio and video editor, Nat Frum.